The arena was alive with noise, alien voices shaking the air. It was a place where thousands gathered to watch battles of blood and power. The ground was covered in dust and old stains of war. The sky above was hidden by giant metallic walls, trapping the sound of the crowd and making it echo even louder. In the center stood the Gladiator, a monster of a being. His body was heavy with muscles. His skin was armored like stone. His eyes glowed red with anger. He held a blade longer than the height of a man. His laughter rolled like thunder across the arena. For the crowd, he was more than a fighter. He was a god of destruction. Before him stood a fragile figure, an old alien woman. Her body was bent with age, her face marked with lines of suffering. She had no weapon, no strength left in her bones. She was brought there as punishment, a weak sacrifice to feed the rage of the gladiator. The crowd cheered louder, hungry for her end. The old woman trembled, but kept her head high. She knew her death was near, yet she did not cry. She stood proud, even in fear. And then, before the gladiator could strike, something happened that froze the entire arena. A man stepped forward, not an alien, not a gladiator, but a human. He walked into the arena with steady steps. His clothes were torn, his armor light. His weapon was no more than a broken piece of steel. The crowd gasped in shock. No human had ever dared to stand in that arena. No human had ever survived its fury. The gladiator turned, his red eyes narrowing. A deep laugh escaped him. "This," he growled, pointing his blade toward the human. The crowd laughed with him. They believed it was madness, a fragile man against a giant beast. But the human did not laugh. He stood tall, his face calm, his eyes sharp. He looked not at the crowd, but at the old woman. She stared back, her lips trembling. She saw not weakness, but fire in his gaze. The announcer's voice roared across the arena. "A challenger has entered. A man dares to fight the champion. Let the fury begin." The gladiator charged. His steps shook the ground like falling boulders. His blade cut the air with a scream. The crowd shouted with wild joy. They were sure the fight would end in one blow. The human did not move, not until the last second. Then, like wind slipping past stone, he bent low and rolled aside. The giant blade missed him by inches, crashing into the ground with a burst of dust. The ground cracked under the force, but the man was already back on his feet. The crowd gasped. The wives of the gladiator, alien women seated high above, leaned forward in surprise. Their eyes followed the human with sudden interest. None of them had seen such boldness. The gladiator snarled and swung again. Faster, harder. The human ducked and darted aside. His broken weapon flashed as he struck, a small cut across the gladiator's leg. It was not deep, not fatal, but it was enough to make the giant stumble. The arena went silent for a heartbeat. Then the noise returned, louder, wilder. The people shouted, some in rage, some in disbelief. A human had drawn blood from the champion. The wives looked at one another, whispers flowing between them. One of them spoke softly. "He fights with no fear." The gladiator roared, fury shaking his chest. He raised his blade high, his voice a beast cry. The human tightened his grip on the broken steel. His breath came slow and steady. He knew he could not match strength with the monster. But he had speed, he had will, he had a reason. Behind him, the old woman whispered, "Please." Her voice was weak, trembling. She had seen death many times, but never had she seen someone ready to fight death for her. The man did not answer, but his stance grew firm, his eyes locked on the gladiator. The crowd felt it too. Something was different. This was not just another fight. This was defiance. Dust swirled around them. The sun above burned down through cracks in the metallic dome. Shadows stretched long across the arena floor. The gladiator charged again, his fury like fire. The human moved once more, every step calculated, every dodge desperate but sharp. The first part of the battle had begun. The crowd did not know it yet, but history was already changing. Because on that day, one man stood against the gladiator's fury, and the universe held its breath. The arena shook as the gladiator roared. His massive body moved like a beast of war. His blade shimmered under the burning light. The human stood ready, his chest rising with steady breaths. Dust swirled around them, as if the earth itself was waiting for blood. The crowd shouted, their voices echoing like thunder. Some screamed for the gladiator to crush the man. Others watched in silence, unable to believe what they were seeing, a fragile human against a monster built for destruction. The gladiator's strike came fast. His blade tore through the air. A storm of strength fell upon the human. The man leaped aside, the blade smashing into the ground. Stone cracked and dust exploded into the air. The shockwave almost knocked him off his feet, but he steadied himself. The crowd gasped. Their champion had missed. The wives of the gladiator leaned closer. Their eyes glimmered. They had seen battles before, many battles, but this was different. The human was not fighting with muscle. He was fighting with speed and will. The gladiator turned, fury glowing in his red eyes. He struck again, faster, sharper. The man blocked with his broken weapon. The sound rang like metal screaming. The force sent pain shooting through his arms. His knees almost gave way. Yet he held. The human pushed back, his blade sliding along the gladiator's. He struck toward the giant's side. The hit was shallow but enough to draw blood. A thin line of dark crimson ran down the armored skin. The gladiator froze for one breath. The crowd erupted. Never before had anyone dared to mark him. The alien wives whispered to each other. One spoke, her voice low but firm. "This man fights like fire." Another replied, "He fights for her, not for himself." Their eyes turned toward the old woman, who watched with trembling lips. The gladiator roared again, shaking the ground. He swung his weapon with both hands. His blade created winds so strong they pulled at the human's body. The man dodged, rolling across the dust. He rose, coughing, blood at the corner of his mouth, but his eyes still burned with defiance. The crowd began to change. No longer did they shout only for the gladiator. Some began to cheer for the human. A strange sound echoed in the air. Hope. The gladiator grew reckless. His rage blinded him. He swung wildly, each blow powerful enough to kill. The human danced around him, barely alive. His body screamed in pain, bruises swelling on his skin. His weapon chipped further, almost useless, yet he refused to stop. He moved closer with each dodge. Each step brought him near the giant. Each strike, though weak, was aimed at the gaps in the gladiator's armor. Small cuts appeared on the beast's body, drops of blood falling to the ground. The wives gasped as they saw it. This was not luck. This was skill. The man was reading the monster. He was studying him like a hunter studying prey. The gladiator howled in anger, his voice like thunder. He raised his blade high, ready to end it in one final strike. The crowd screamed. The ground shook. The human's breath slowed. His heart pounded. He saw the blade coming down. In that instant, time slowed. His eyes locked on the old woman. She whispered one word. "Please." He felt the weight of her fear, the weight of her hope. The man moved. He stepped into the storm instead of away. His broken weapon met the gladiator's blade. The clash was deafening. Sparks flew like fire. His knees bent under the force. His arms shook with pain. But he did not fall. Instead, he twisted, sliding along the giant's weapon. His blade cut across the gladiator's arm. The monster roared in shock. His grip loosened. His blade sank slightly into the dust. The crowd gasped again. The wives stood from their seats, their eyes wide. Their voices whispered, "He can do it." The gladiator pulled back, fury and disbelief in his gaze. The human stood, battered, bleeding, his chest rising with heavy breaths, his weapon cracked, his body broken, but his spirit unshaken. The crowd no longer laughed. The arena was no longer a place of mockery. It had become a place of silence, a silence filled with fear, with wonder, with awe. For the first time, the gladiator's fury had been stopped. And for the first time, the human stood not as prey, but as a challenger. The gladiator's fury rose like a storm. His chest heaved with anger, his eyes glowing red as if fire lived inside them. His blade lifted once more, heavier than thunder. The human stood weak, his arms bruised, his weapon chipped and almost broken, yet his eyes were sharp, his stance unshaken. The crowd could feel the tension. No one spoke. No one laughed. The silence of thousands pressed down upon the arena. Even the alien wives leaned forward, their faces pale with disbelief. They had seen battles end in minutes, but this man refused to fall. The gladiator attacked. His blade came down like a falling mountain. The ground shook as dust and stone split. The man leaped aside, his body barely escaping death. His breath was heavy, sweat dripping in his eyes. But he kept moving. He had no choice. The gladiator roared and swung again. Each strike was faster, crueler. Each blow carried enough power to crush bones. The human dodged, rolled, and sometimes blocked with his broken weapon. The sound of metal striking metal filled the air like screams. Every time the man blocked, his arms burned with pain, his muscles cried out, his vision blurred. But he forced himself to stand. He remembered the old woman, her trembling voice, her whispered plea. He remembered why he stepped into the arena. He was not fighting for glory. He was fighting for life, for honor. The gladiator's rage blinded him. His movements became wild, uncontrolled. The human saw it. He studied it. He watched every step, every swing. He saw where the giant's armor bent, where his skin was exposed. He struck when he could, small cuts, shallow wounds. Yet each mark slowed the gladiator little by little. The giant grew tired, his breath turning into growls, his strikes slower, his rage louder. The crowd began to change. At first they screamed for the gladiator's victory. Now they shouted the human's name. They had no name for him, but they cried for him anyway. Hope rose from their voices. It echoed across the walls like a song of rebellion. The wives watched with wide eyes, their whispers stronger now. He is not just fighting. One said, he is surviving. Another added, he is teaching us what courage means. The gladiator roared again. His pride was torn, his body marked with cuts. He raised his weapon for another strike, but the man was ready. He slid beneath the swing, rolled, and slashed across the gladiator's leg. The giant stumbled. His knee struck the ground. The arena shook with shock. Gasps filled the air. The wives covered their mouths. The old woman wept, her tears falling into the dust. She whispered again, please live. The gladiator slammed his blade into the ground, forcing himself back up. His rage was endless. He bared his teeth. His voice shook the walls. He lifted his blade once more. The human staggered to his feet, his breath ragged, his body broken, his weapon nearly gone. But in his eyes burned something greater than fear. He stared at the monster, at the blood dripping from its wounds, and he whispered to himself, not yet. The crowd grew louder. Their cries no longer belonged to the gladiator. They belonged to the man, a human, fragile, small, yet unbroken. The gladiator swung with everything he had. His blade screamed through the air. The man stepped aside, so close that the wind of the strike tore at his skin. He countered with one last desperate slash. His weapon cut across the gladiator's arm again. Deeper this time, blood spilled onto the sand. The giant roared in pain. He stumbled back. His weapon wavered. For the first time, the champion looked uncertain. The crowd's silence shattered into wild shouts. The wives stood together, their voices trembling. He cannot win, one whispered. But he refuses to lose, another answered. The man fell to one knee, his strength nearly gone. Yet he lifted his broken weapon once more. His hand shook. His body cried for rest. But his spirit still rose. He looked at the gladiator and whispered, come. The monster bared his teeth, rage burning brighter than ever. He lifted his weapon high. His shadow fell over the man. And in that moment, the entire arena held its breath. Because against all odds, the human still stood. The gladiator's roar shook the arena. His anger was like fire spreading across the battlefield. He raised his weapon high above his head, its edge glowing under the harsh light. The crowd screamed, their voices a storm of chaos. Some shouted for blood, others for hope. The human stood weak, his knees trembling, his weapon cracked, his body bleeding, his arms felt like stone, yet his eyes never left the giant. He knew one mistake would end him, but he also knew the gladiator was not invincible. The gladiator brought down his weapon with all his strength. The The sound was like the sky tearing apart. The man rolled aside. The blade struck the ground. Dust exploded around them. For one brief moment, the giant's guard was open. The human saw it. With a desperate cry, he lunged forward. His broken steel scraped across the gladiator's side. The cut was deeper than before. Blood spilled. The smell of iron filled the air. The crowd gasped. The wives of the gladiator leaned forward, their hands gripping the railing. The gladiator staggered. He turned slowly, disbelief flashing in his eyes. Never before had any opponent wounded him more than once. His pride screamed as loud as his rage. He charged like a beast in pain, swinging wildly. His blade cut through the air, but it no longer carried the same control. The human used every ounce of his speed. He ducked, dodged, and stepped back, his breathing heavy, his chest burning, his eyes fixed only on the weak spots he had found. Each movement was not random. It was careful, measured. He struck again, another shallow cut, then another. The wives whispered to each other, "He is reading him." One said, "He is turning the monster's strength against him." Another added. The old woman watched with tears in her eyes. She pressed her hands together and prayed, not for herself, but for the man who risked his life for her. The gladiator's fury grew dangerous. His swings were faster, but without aim. His rage clouded his mind. The man slid past one attack, then another, until finally he saw it, a weakness near the gladiator's knee. The armor was cracked from earlier blows. He struck, his weapon sliced into the gap. The gladiator roared, his leg buckling. The giant stumbled, one knee crashing to the ground. The arena trembled with the weight. The crowd erupted in wild cries, half cheered in fury, half in awe. For the first time, the champion knelt. The wives rose to their feet, their eyes wide. Their whispers turned to shouts. "He is forcing the monster down," they cried. The old woman gasped, covering her mouth, hope flashing across her face. The gladiator slammed his fist into the ground, dragging himself up. His body shook with rage. His blood painted the sand. His pride was torn apart. His voice thundered, "I will crush you." The man stood, barely breathing, his chest rising and falling like waves, his weapon almost shattered, his body almost broken. But his spirit grew taller than the walls of the arena. He lifted his blade once more and pointed it toward the giant, his voice steady. "Come then." The crowd fell silent. A strange energy filled the air. It was no longer just a battle. It was a war between will and fury. The gladiator charged again, but his body betrayed him. His wounds slowed him. His strength began to fade. The human dodged and countered, not with brute force, but with precision. Each strike targeted a weak point. Each move chipped away at the beast's power. The wives clutched each other's arms, their hearts racing. They had never seen courage like this, never seen a man so small stand against a monster so great. At last, the gladiator swung one more time. Desperate, his blade missed, the momentum pulling him off balance. The human struck with his last strength. His weapon cut deep across the giant's arm. The blade slipped from the gladiator's hand, crashing into the dust. The arena froze. Silence fell heavy. All eyes locked on the impossible sight. The champion stood disarmed, his weapon gone. The human stood shaking, his weapon nearly broken his hand. He raised it weakly, his chest heaving, his voice silent, but his presence louder than thunder. The turning point had come, and the crowd knew it. The arena was silent, a silence so heavy that even the wind dared not move. Dust floated in the air, glowing under the burning light. The gladiator stood weaponless, his chest rising like a storm. His red eyes burned with fury and disbelief. The human faced him, his body broken, his hands shaking, his weapon cracked almost to its end. His breaths came ragged, his legs weak, but his eyes glowed with fire, the fire of a man who refused to fall. The crowd held its breath. Never before had they seen the champion disarmed. Never before had they seen a human still standing at this stage. The wives stood in awe, their voices trembling. "This is no man," one whispered. "This is something more." The gladiator roared. His voice split the air like thunder. He lunged forward with his bare hands. his fists heavy as stone, his claws sharper than knives. The ground shook under his steps. The man braced himself, his weapon ready. The clash came. The gladiator swung his arm. The man blocked. His weapon screeched under the force. A crack ran deeper through the steel. Pain shot up his arm. But he pushed forward. His blade cut across the gladiator's chest. Blood spilled like fire, staining the dust red. The crowd screamed, some in anger, others in disbelief. The wives gasped, clutching their hearts. The old woman wept, her tears falling freely, for she saw what no one else could, a man turning death into defiance. The gladiator struck again, his fists hammering down. The man dodged, but not fully. A heavy blow slammed into his shoulder. Pain exploded, his body spun, crashing into the ground. Blood filled his mouth, his vision blurred. Yet he rose, staggering but alive. The gladiator laughed, but it was hollow. His pride was shattered, his strength fading. The human stood once more, broken yet unbroken. He lifted his blade high. Though it shook in his grip, his voice was weak but clear. I am not done. The crowd erupted. Their voices shook the sky. The sound of hope and chaos mixed into a storm. The wives shouted now, "Stand, humans, stand." Their eyes blazed with fire. The old woman clutched her chest, whispering prayers. The gladiator charged, his final attack, his arms raised to crush, his steps thundered across the arena. The human waited, his eyes sharp, his breath slow. Time itself seemed to stop. The giant shadow fell over him. Then, at the last heartbeat, the man moved. He stepped forward instead of back. His blade rose with every ounce of strength left in his body. The gladiator's fist came down, but the blade struck first. It cut deep across his chest, tearing through armor and flesh. The roar of the gladiator filled the sky. His body shook. His knees buckled. He staggered back. His blood poured like a river into the dust. The man fell to one knee, his blade snapping in two. He was broken, yet victorious. The giant collapsed. His massive body struck the ground with the force of an earthquake. The arena trembled. Dust swallowed the air, and then there was silence. The crowd stared, their mouths open, for the impossible had happened. The champion of the arena was dead, defeated by a human. The wives cried out, their voices a mixture of shock and wonder. One whispered, "He has done it." Another said, "He has broken the fury." The old woman fell to her knees, her tears falling into the sand. She whispered, "Thank you." The human stood slowly, his body shaking, his breath heavy. He looked at the fallen gladiator, then at the crowd. He did not raise his hands in victory. He did not shout. He simply stood, covered in blood, alive. The arena exploded with sound. The people roared, their voices louder than storms. Some cried his name. Others cursed his defiance. But all of them knew history had changed that day. One man had stood against the gladiator's fury, and victory was sealed in blood. The dust began to settle. The body of the fallen gladiator lay heavy on the ground. His blood seeped into the sand, dark and endless. The silence that followed was deafening. Thousands of alien eyes stared at the lone human who still stood, his body bruised, his armor torn, his weapon broken in half. Yet he was alive. The crowd erupted. Some shouted in rage, unable to accept the death of their champion. Others roared in awe, voices trembling with respect. The sound was chaos, but all of it centered on one man, the human who had done the impossible. The alien wives stood together, their eyes locked on the man. Their hands clutched the rail as if they feared they might fall. They had seen power before. They had seen warriors stronger, faster, deadlier, but they had never seen a man fight with such fire. A man who had no reason to win, and yet had chosen to stand. One wife whispered, her voice shaking, "He fought for honor, not for himself." Another answered, "He protected the weak, even when death was certain." A third added, "He is not like the others. He is different." Their eyes glowed with something new, not fear, not pity, but respect. The old woman who had been marked for death crawled forward, her body weak, her legs trembling. She reached the man and bowed low. Her forehead touched the blood-soaked sand. Her voice broke as she said, "You are my protector. Tears streamed down her face. The human looked at her, his chest rose and fell, his breath was ragged, his body screamed with pain. Yet he bent down and lifted her gently, his arms shaky but steady enough. He did not speak, but the act itself carried more weight than any words. The crowd's voices grew louder. A chant began. At first it was scattered, broken, but soon it spread like fire through the arena. They shouted for him. Not for the gladiator, for the human who had changed the story of the arena. The rulers of the Colosseum sat frozen, their faces pale. Their champion was gone, their pride destroyed. Yet even they could not deny the truth. A new power had risen, one they had not expected. The wives stepped down from their high place, their movements slow, graceful, heavy with meaning. The crowd parted for them. Their robes shimmered under the fading light, their eyes never leaving the man who stood with blood on his hands but honor in his heart. They approached him one by one. Each of them bowed their heads, their voices soft but clear. "You are a master now," one said. "Not because of chains, not because of power," another added, "but because of courage." The human froze, his eyes widened. He had never asked for this. He had never wanted it. He had fought only to protect, only to honor life. Yet in their voices he heard no falsehood, no weakness, only truth. The old woman stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes filled with gratitude. She whispered, "They see what I see." The crowd continued to shout, their chants shaking the walls. The arena that once belonged to the gladiator now belonged to the man. He had no crown, no throne, no glory, but he had something greater. He had respect. The wives circled around him, their faces lit with strange fire. Their whispers filled the air. "He belongs to us now," they said, not as a slave, not as a fighter, but as the one they chose. The human lowered his broken weapon. His body swayed, exhaustion pulling at him. Yet he stood, his spirit refused to bow. He looked at the crowd, then at the wives. His silence was powerful. His eyes alone carried the weight of victory. And in that moment, the recognition was complete. He was no longer just a man. He was master. The arena still echoed with the chants of thousands. The walls that once celebrated the gladiator's victories now shook with a new name, a name that belonged to a single human. He stood in the center, his body broken, his armor torn, his weapon nothing more than shattered steel. Yet in that moment, he was taller than any king. The gladiator's body lay still, a mountain of muscle and fury brought low. The crowd stared at the impossible sight. Some wept in anger, some in disbelief, but many raised their voices with respect. The sound was no longer a roar of bloodlust. It was a hymn of honor. The alien wives surrounded him. Their robes moved like flowing rivers, their faces lit with fire. They looked at him not as a stranger, not as prey, but as the one who had turned death into life. Their voices whispered together, "Master." The word was not forced. It was not chained. It was chosen. The old woman stood at his side, leaning on his arm for support. Her tears still flowed, but they were no longer of fear. They were of hope. She looked at the crowd and raised her trembling hand. Her voice, though weak, carried through the silence. "He fought for us, not for himself." The wives nodded, their eyes never leaving the man. One of them said softly, "He is the strength we did not know we needed." Another answered, "He has shown us what true power means." Their words spread among the people like sparks catching flame. The rulers of the arena sat frozen. Their power had cracked, their champion destroyed, their control broken. Yet they too felt the shift. The human had become something they could not bend. His presence had turned the crowd. His courage had shattered the chains of fear. Slowly, the man began to walk, his steps heavy, his body screaming with pain. The wives followed him, their movements graceful, protective, their eyes full of devotion. He did not raise his head in arrogance. He did not demand praise. He simply walked, leaving blood-stained footprints across the sand. The crowd parted as he moved. Their chants grew louder. Voices from every corner shouted, "Human, master, protector." The sound rose like thunder, shaking the sky. The old woman whispered as she walked with him. You were one against fury, yet you stood. You were alone, yet you carried us all. Her words made the wives bow their heads in respect. Their faces glowed with something stronger than admiration. It was loyalty. At the gates of the arena, the man paused. He looked back once more. His eyes swept over the fallen gladiator, the roaring crowd, the broken sand soaked with blood. He had come as nothing. He left as something eternal. The wives stood beside him. Their hands reached toward him, not to bind him, but to hold him. Their voices together whispered, You are ours. The man did not answer. His silence was enough, for in silence lived truth. The gates opened. The light of the outside world poured in. The man stepped forward, the wives following close. Behind them the chants of the crowd thundered, echoing into the stars above. No one would forget what had happened. No one would forget the day a single man stood against the fury of a gladiator. No one would forget how his courage turned fear into fire. He did not fight for glory. He did not fight for power. He fought for honor. And in doing so, he became more than a warrior. He became master. Not master of chains, not master of thrones, but master of hearts.